Hey, all right. So what I want to do is to take a bunch of blocks in Unity and collide them together. And this is going to be for every single combination of trigger or not trigger selected, with a rigid body or without, and with a kinematic body or without, and for every possible pair of these values. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at which of these combinations result in on trigger enter firing, and which of these combinations result in on collision enter firing. So this is like the blocks that I'm going to use, but like before that, let's show what I mean. So like if we take a block in Unity, we've got our box collider or some sort of 3D collider, and then there's this option is trigger, and is trigger changes how Unity behaves. Essentially, with it deselected, other objects can collide with you and bounce off, won't go through you if they're like using physics. And with is trigger selected, then the objects can just go through you. If you're not using physics, then the objects can go through you anyway. This affects when you're using physics. And we've also got like this concept of adding a rigid body. Right, here we've got this option is kinematic, and again this affects collisions. Basically, with is kinematic selected, um, this is not going to take part in physics. The rigid body is a physics thing. It's in physics. When you do add component, well, we can do the add component, right? It's found under physics. But whoops. But if we turn on the is kinematic, then it no longer takes part in physics, but it will still take part in collisions. And so when there's a collision, there's two things colliding, and each of these can have different combinations of trigger with or without a rigid body and with or without is kinematic selected, and what happens with these different combinations. So let's try. So basically what I've got here is every single possible combination. Let's maximize this. Right, so we've got these different colors. So basically these blocks are going to collide like this, okay? Like the top and the bottom ones are going to collide. And so each of these is in a pair. The ones with this blue block, these have trigger selected. So this is in the collider. Like the collider, if it's got a blue block, trigger is selected. If there's no blue block, it's got a collider, but trigger is not selected. The yellow is the rigid body. If it's got yellow, it's got a rigid body. If it doesn't have yellow, it doesn't have a rigid body. And purple is kinematic. So kinematic only applies if there's a rigid body. And then if there's a rigid body, you can choose to have kinematic selected or not selected. Then, so that's the inputs. And we've got inputs on both sides. So the one side can have a, well, the top or bottom. The top can have a different configuration than the bottom. And here we've got all possible combinations. So that's the inputs. And then for the outputs, we've got on trigger enter and on collision enter. So basically, I've added a script into these somewhere. Well, anyway, if I go to scripts, I mean, I guess I can just show the script somewhere. Not that one. Test collide. So basically, that's creating things. Yeah, so basically, I added this script into the collider, and it's basically it's got an on collision enter, it's got an on trigger enter, and basically, it's going to turn the collision block, whatever the color it was, red. If the on collision fires, and it's going to turn the trigger block uh, green if there's a collision. So if we go back to here, and then let's just run this briefly and maximize this. And so we just run this through. So basically everywhere there's a green, the on trigger enter fired, and everywhere where it's red, then the on collision enter fired. So let's just stop this and run it. So we'll maximize this. So basically, I'm just going to collide them together. And then after they collide, I'm just going to rearrange them so that they all go back to where they started. Right, so we've collided them all and then put them back to where they started. And then we can look at which things cause what. So for the on trigger enter basically always fires if we have at least one side with the trigger ticked, but it doesn't have to be the side that receives the trigger. Like both sides will receive the trigger. Like these green blocks, all ones with these green blocks received an on trigger enter. And we can see that these ones all had trigger, but these ones all did not have trigger. But since the other side had trigger, so the trigger fired. The only time the trigger doesn't fire is if there's no trigger at all, like the ones on the right hand side, neither side has a trigger, or if there's a trigger but no rigid body. It looks like there has to be at least one side with a rigid body. So this one and this and this, there's a trigger, but there's no rigid body. Whereas, for example, if we take this, no, this one, this side has a rigid body. No, sorry, this side has a rigid body. And so there's a trigger event on both sides. And then if we take the other way around, so this side has a rigid body, this side doesn't have a trigger, doesn't have a rigid body, but that's okay. This still fires a trigger on both sides. So actually you only need a rigid body on one side and a trigger on one side, but it doesn't have to be, they don't have to be on the same side. Here we've got the trigger and rigid body on one side, the trigger fires on the other object. And then here we've got, well, let's find one where we've got trigger. So here we want trigger on one side, and so here we've got rigid body on one side, trigger on the other, and trigger fires on both objects. So trigger fires pretty much any time as long as you have at least one rigid body and at least one trigger, then it's going to fire. Right, what about collision? So collision's a little bit more picky. So for collision, we can ignore the trigger. It doesn't affect anything at all. Like, yeah. So if we've got a rigid body on one side and not on the other, then collision will fire. If we've got a rigid body but kinematic is selected and nothing on this side, collision will not fire. If we've got two rigid bodies, collision will fire for each. Oh yeah, and if we've got just a rigid body on one side, nothing on the other, then collision will fire for each of them. If we've got two rigid bodies, one of them has kinematic, then collision will fire for each. But if we've got two rigid bodies and both of them are kinematic, then collision will not fire. So if you're doing like games which don't have physics and you're using kinematic, then you're not going to be able to get in collisions, at least not like this. Yeah, and then you can see all the possible combinations. Now, it is actually possible to get collisions between two kinematic objects. We just have to change the settings a little. So if we come out of here and we go into edit, project settings, and we go into physics, there's a setting here, contact pairs mode. And at the moment it sets default contact pairs, which is the default. If we change that, we can change that to enable kinematic pairs. And then we will get collisions, if I remember rightly, between kinematic and kinematic. So let's rerun and maximize. And so let's collide them all together, split them apart. And now here we've got these two kinematic objects. They both have a collision. So the ones where we're missing a collision, here we've got kinematic on one side, nothing on the other, we don't get a collision. But if we've got just rigid body on one side, nothing on the other, then we do on both sides. And then this is the other way around. And yeah. Yeah, there's also a couple of other settings, but I think we've pretty much covered everything we would want to cover here, right? So the other ones is just playing with the triggers, right? All the information we want to know about collisions in the absence of triggers is over here. But I mean, a question is, does adding a trigger affect the collisions? Well, no. When we've got triggers, then we still have the collisions firing. Like even though we've got the on collision enter, sorry, we've got the on trigger enter, the on collision enter still fires, and having the trigger set on either or both sides doesn't stop the collision from firing. And so, well, let's look at the case where we've got trigger set on both sides. So trigger set on both sides and no rigid body on either side, no collision. We add a rigid body on one side, then we get a collision. We get a collision. Oh, actually, so the trigger does make an effect, right? Because without the triggers, having a rigid body on one side gives a collision on both sides to both objects, right? Yes. But when we've got triggers, having a rigid body on one side, you get a collision only on that side, and the other object does not receive a collision. The other object will receive a trigger. Both objects will receive a trigger, but it won't receive a collision. And then if we make it kinematic, then neither object gets a collision, which is the same as if we don't have any triggers at all. If we make both sides kinematic, we get a collision on both sides, even in the presence of triggers, and that's true. If we have a trigger on one side and not on the other, then we still get collisions on both sides. So there we go. There's actually another setting, but it seems like we've covered pretty much everything. The other setting is we can do enable all contact, which is this is like enable. Oh, let's do enable all contact pairs and see what happens. So we maximize that. So we have to collide them first, right? I don't know why these are already collided. Maybe they collided with the collider anyway, whatever. Right, so now we've pretty much got collisions. So here we get a collision. Let's just undo that and see what we got here on the right hand side before. So before, when we had kinematic pairs, if we run that, then collide those together. It seems there's a little bug down here. I guess they might be colliding with this. Anyway, right, so there's some collisions missing here, right? When we have kinematic on one side, nothing on the other, no collision on either side, and the same here. So kinematic on one side, nothing on the other, like just a collider, right? They all have a collider, they just don't all have rigid bodies or kinematic or trigger. So here we've got kinematic on one side, collider on the other, no collision. But when we change to all contact pairs, we do get a collision on both sides, even if there's just a kinematic on one side. Right, so let's run it. I guess this is a bug. I should probably fix that. But anyway. Right, so now we get collisions for all of these. So basically, with that final option, all contact pairs, all you have to have for a collision, in the absence of triggers, right? All you have to have for a collision is a rigid body, could be kinematic or not. In either case, you will get a collision. Now, there's some collisions missing here. Why is that? So here we've got a rigid body on one side, a trigger on the other, no collision. A kinematic on one side, a trigger on the other, no collision. So yeah, it looks like sometimes adding a trigger will prevent there being a collision if you've got a rigid body only on one side. So what other collisions are we missing? This one, we've got a kinematic and a trigger on one side and no collision on this side. But we do get a collision on the side with the trigger. But here we don't get here we get a collision on the side without the trigger. So we're getting a collision on the side which has the rigid body and not on the side which has the trigger and no rigid body. So it looks like collisions are a little bit more complicated than trigger. Trigger seems pretty reliable, and then collisions is less reliable given different combinations like kinematic and so on. So there we go. So all right, so I've like presented all those different options and pretty much every single combination. Oh, there's one other thing that can break collision. If you uh, go into your code and you have physics stored in simulation set to false, and you forget you did that, because I did this, like this is why I wrote this program, because I'd actually set this to false and forgotten about it. This turns off physics. If you turn off physics, you don't get any collisions, no matter any combination of trigger or rigid body or kinematic. You just will not get a collision. So physics has to be running. So there we go. I think that's pretty much every single combination we could have. So yeah, thank you for watching if you got this far.